A Tale of Werewolves, Alphas, and Fated Destinies, written by Olivia Stone. The autumn twilight cast long shadows across the ceremonial grounds of the Shadowmere Pack, painting everything in shades of amber and blood orange, and Seraphina Frost stood at the center of it all, wearing a simple white dress that seemed to mock her with its purity, feeling every single pair of eyes boring into her like physical weights, pressing down on her shoulders, until she thought she might collapse right there in front of the 200 wolves who had gathered to witness what was supposed to be her mating ceremony. But what she suspected, deep in her bones with a certainty that made her stomach twist with nausea, was actually going to be her final humiliation. Her long silver hair, which fell like a waterfall of liquid moonlight down to her waist, had been carefully braided by Elena, the only person in this entire pack who had ever shown her genuine kindness. But Seraphina could see the way the other wolves looked at it, the way their eyes filled with that familiar mixture of disgust and unease that had followed her every single day of her 24 years of existence, as if the color of her hair was somehow a personal offense against nature itself, rather than just a genetic quirk she'd been born with and had absolutely no control over. Her skin, pale as fresh snow and almost translucent in the fading light, seemed to glow with an otherworldly quality that made children whisper about ghosts and made adults avert their eyes, as if looking at her too long might curse them with whatever affliction they believed she carried in her blood. And her violet gray eyes, which her mother had once told her were beautiful before the rogue attack that killed both her parents when she was only 8 years old, now seemed like just another mark of how different she was. How wrong. How utterly unsuitable for the life that normal wolves took for granted. Garrett Blackthorn stood across from her, 10 feet away, but it might as well have been a canyon for all the distance his body language conveyed, and she could see the disgust written plainly across his handsome face. Could see the way his jaw clenched as if he was fighting the urge to spit. Could see how his dark eyes refused to meet hers, because apparently even looking at her was too much to ask from the man who was supposed to become her mate in the next few minutes, according to the arrangement that had been made by Alpha Donovan, who stood between them now with the ceremonial binding rope in his weathered hands and an expression on his face that suggested he knew exactly how this was going to end and was merely going through the motions because tradition demanded it. The entire pack had turned out for this spectacle, and Seraphina could hear their whispers cutting through the evening air like tiny knives, each comment a fresh wound on her already battered soul. And she heard them say things like, "I can't believe Garrett has to take her," and "poor thing, having to mate with the cursed Omega," and "maybe if she keeps her head covered, he won't have to look at that strange hair." And each word made her want to shift into her small silver wolf and run into the forest and never come back. But she had learned over 16 years of living as an orphan in this pack that running only made things worse because they always found you and brought you back, and then the punishment for trying to escape was always so much more painful than whatever you had been running from in the first place. Alpha Donovan cleared his throat, and the crowd fell silent with an anticipation that made Seraphina's skin crawl, because she knew they weren't excited about a beautiful union or a blessed mating, but rather they were waiting to see if Garrett would actually go through with it, or if he would do what she suspected he'd been planning to do all along, which was to reject her publicly and thoroughly, so that everyone would know beyond any shadow of doubt that she was unwanted, unclaimed, and completely worthless, even by the standards of an arranged mating that was really just the pack's way of getting rid of a burden they'd been carrying since her parents died, protecting wolves who hadn't even bothered to attend their funeral. The binding ceremony was supposed to begin with the Alpha asking both parties if they came willingly to the mating, and Seraphina knew she was supposed to say yes because she had no other choice. because unclaimed omegas over the age of 23 were considered burdens on the pack resources, because Alpha Donovan had made it very clear that if she didn't accept Garrett's generous offer to take her as a mate, despite her obvious deficiencies, then she would be cast out as a rogue, and she would have to survive on her own in the wilderness, where lone wolves rarely lasted more than a few weeks before starvation or rival packs or rogues killed them in ways that were neither quick nor merciful. We are gathered under the light of the rising moon to witness the joining of two wolves. Alpha Donovan began, his voice carrying across the ceremonial grounds with the practiced ease of someone who had officiated dozens of these ceremonies over his 40 years as pack leader. And Seraphina focused on his words rather than on the way Garrett was looking at her, like she was something rotten that had washed up on the riverbank, trying desperately to hold on to whatever shreds of dignity she had left, even though she could feel them slipping through her fingers like water. Garrett Blackthorn, beta of the Shadowmere pack and heir to the alpha position, do you come willingly to this mating, understanding that the bond you form today will tie you to your mate for the rest of your natural life and possibly beyond? Should the moon goddess will it so? The question hung in the air like a blade waiting to fall, and Seraphina held her breath without meaning to, her heart hammering so hard in her chest that she was certain everyone could hear it, and she watched Garrett's face transform from mere disgust into something that looked almost like glee, the expression of someone who had been waiting for this exact moment and was about to enjoy it far more than any decent person should enjoy causing pain to someone who had never done anything to harm them. No, Garrett said, and the single word fell like a stone into still water, creating ripples that spread outward through the assembled pack in the form of gasps and excited whispers. And Seraphina felt something inside her chest crack, even though she had known this was coming, had suspected it from the moment Alpha Donovan had informed her of the arrangement 3 weeks ago. But knowing something in your head and experiencing it in your heart were two completely different things, and the difference between them was the space where hope lived and died. I, Garrett Blackthorn, reject this Omega as my mate, he continued, his voice growing louder and more confident with each word, feeding off the energy of the crowd like a performer who had finally found his audience. And Seraphina could see the cruel satisfaction in his eyes as he watched her face, as he witnessed the moment when the last tiny spark of hope she'd been trying to protect finally guttered out and died. "Look at her, all of you, really look at her," Garrett said, gesturing toward Seraphina with a sweep of his arm that made her feel like an object on display, rather than a person with feelings and thoughts and dreams that were currently being ground into dust beneath his words. Silver hair like a ghost, like something that crawled out of a grave instead of being born like a normal wolf. Skin so pale that she looks like she's already dead and just hasn't realized it yet. Eyes that are neither blue nor gray but some unsettling color in between that makes you wonder if she's even really one of us or if she's something else entirely. Something the moon goddess made wrong and then abandoned because even divine beings make mistakes sometimes. The crowd murmured their agreement, and Seraphina heard voices she recognized. Wolves who had grown up alongside her in the pack. People who had eaten meals at the same communal tables and attended the same pack gatherings and training sessions, and they were all nodding along with Garrett's words as if he was speaking profound truths rather than just being cruel for the sake of cruelty. "She's weak," Garrett continued, warming to his subject now like a preacher who had found his rhythm, and Seraphina wanted to argue, wanted to point out that she had survived 16 years as an orphan with no one to protect her or speak up for her. Wanted to mention that she had taught herself healing arts from watching Elena work, and that she could identify every medicinal herb in the forest and knew how to set broken bones and treat fevers and infections. but her throat had closed up and her voice had abandoned her. Somewhere around the time Garrett had compared her to something that crawled out of a grave. Her wolf is small and pathetic, barely worth the classification, and I've seen her in training. Watched her get knocked down by wolves half her size because she doesn't have the aggression or the strength to defend herself properly. And what kind of future alpha needs a mate who can't even hold her own in a simple sparring match? He was building to something. Serafina could feel it, could sense the way he was constructing his rejection piece by piece, like someone building a wall specifically designed to keep her out. And she found herself thinking about her parents, wondering if they were watching from wherever wolves went after death, wondering if they were ashamed of what their daughter had become, or if they understood that she had tried, had really truly tried to be good enough and strong enough and normal enough, but had failed at all three. "I won't tie myself to defective goods," Garrett declared, and the phrase hit Serafina like a physical blow, driving the air from her lungs and making her knees threaten to buckle, because being called defective meant you were broken beyond repair, meant you were trash that should have been thrown away instead of being kept around, taking up space and resources that could have been used on someone who actually mattered. "I deserve a real Omega, someone beautiful and strong and worthy of standing beside a future alpha, not this moon-cursed freak who probably can't even bear healthy pups given how wrong everything about her is." And that last part, the suggestion that even her most basic biological function as an Omega was somehow tainted by whatever curse people believed she carried, was almost too much, was the kind of insult that burrowed deep under your skin and made a home there where it would live forever, poisoning everything it touched. The pack was openly laughing now, and Serafina could see faces she recognized, people who had seemed kind, or at least neutral in the past, and they were all joining in the mockery as if they had just been waiting for permission to express what they had always felt. And she realized with a clarity that was almost painful that she had never belonged here, had never been anything more than a burden they tolerated because pack law required it, but who they would be happy to see gone because her absence would be so much easier than her presence. Alpha Donovan cleared his throat again, and the laughter died down to excited whispers, and his face, when he looked at Serafina, held something that might have been pity, if pity wasn't just another form of contempt dressed up in kinder clothing. "Serafina Frost," he said, and hearing her full name spoken aloud in front of the entire pack felt like a formal pronouncement of judgment, like the moment before an execution when they read out your crimes so everyone knows why you're about to die. "You have been rejected by Garrett, by Blackthorn, and as such, you are no longer under consideration for mating within this pack. And furthermore, as an unclaimed Omega past the age of 23, who has now been publicly rejected, you are hereby given until dawn to gather whatever belongings you possess and remove yourself from Shadowmere Pack territory. And should you remain past that deadline, or should you attempt to return at any point in the future, you will be considered a rogue wolf and subject to immediate execution upon discovery, as is our right under the ancient laws that govern pack territories and the treatment of wolves who exist outside pack protection." The words were a death sentence dressed up in formal language, because everyone knew that lone wolves didn't survive for long in the wilderness, that the world outside pack territories was filled with dangers that required the strength and protection of a pack to overcome, and sending her out alone with winter coming was essentially telling her to go die somewhere where they wouldn't have to watch it happen or feel guilty about it afterward. Serafina wanted to say something, wanted to defend herself or argue, or at least maintain some shred of dignity. But when she opened her mouth, nothing came out except a small sound that might have been the beginning of a sob, or might have been her voice trying to form words and failing. And she saw the triumph in Garrett's eyes at her silence, saw the way he smiled like someone who had just won a contest he'd been training for his entire life. She tried to hold back the tears because crying would just confirm everything they believed about her weakness, but they came anyway, hot and shameful, sliding down her pale cheeks and making her vision blur until the faces of the pack members became indistinct shapes in the gathering darkness. And through it all, she could hear the whispers continuing. People saying things like, "Good riddance," and "Maybe now we can give her food rations to wolves who actually deserve them," and "I always knew she was cursed. You could tell just by looking at her." Elena tried to step forward from where she'd been standing at the edge of the crowd, tried to push through to reach Serafina, but Alpha Donovan held up one hand and stopped her with a look that promised consequences if she interfered with pack justice. And Serafina met Elena's eyes across the distance and tried to convey without words that it was okay, that Elena shouldn't risk her own position in the pack for someone who was already lost, even though nothing about this situation was actually okay and probably never would be again. The crowd began to disperse, the entertainment of her humiliation now concluded and their evening meal waiting for them back at the pack houses, and they left in groups of 2 and 3, still talking and laughing about what they had just witnessed. And Serafina stood alone in the ceremonial grounds as the last light faded from the sky and the first stars began to appear overhead like distant witnesses to her complete and utter destruction. She had until dawn, which meant she had maybe 6 hours to pack up the few belongings she owned and leave the only home she had ever known. Not that it had ever really felt like home, given that home was supposed to be a place where you were wanted and welcomed and loved. And this place had been none of those things for her. But it had been familiar, and familiar was better than the complete unknown that waited for her beyond the pack borders. In the wilderness, where she would have to figure out how to survive on her own, or die trying. And given how her life had gone so far, dying seemed like the more likely outcome. She finally managed to make her legs move, forced herself to walk away from the ceremonial grounds with whatever dignity she could scrape together. And she didn't look back, because looking back would mean seeing the place where her last hope had died, and she couldn't bear to witness that particular murder scene twice in one night. And as she walked through the darkening forest toward the small cabin where Elena lived and worked, where Serafina had been staying in a tiny room that was barely larger than a closet, but which had been the closest thing to sanctuary she'd had since her parents died, she tried to prepare herself for the impossible task of packing up a life and walking away from everything she'd ever known into a future that promised nothing but hardship and loneliness and almost certain death. And the worst part, the part that made her chest ache with a pain that had nothing to do with physical injury, was that some small, pathetic part of her had actually hoped that maybe Garrett would go through with it, that maybe having someone, anyone, even someone who could barely stand to look at her, would be better than being completely alone. And now she knew with absolute certainty that she wasn't even worth that small mercy, that she was so fundamentally wrong and broken that even an arranged mating born of obligation rather than affection was too much to ask for someone like her. The path to Elena's cabin seemed longer than usual, or maybe it was just that Serafina's legs felt like they were made of lead, and her whole body felt heavy with the weight of everything that had just happened. And she was so lost in her own misery that she almost didn't notice Elena waiting for her on the cabin's small porch until the older woman called out her name. "Serafina, child, come inside quickly. We don't have much time and there's so much I need to tell you before you leave," Elena said, and there was an urgency in her voice that cut through Serafina's fog of despair and made her look up, made her focus on Elena's face, where she saw not pity, but something else. Something that looked almost like determination mixed with a knowledge of secrets that had been kept too long. Serafina climbed the porch steps on shaking legs and followed Elena into the warm interior of the cabin that smelled like dried herbs and wood smoke, and all the medicinal tinctures that Elena prepared for treating the pack's various ailments. And she watched as the old healer moved around the small space with purpose, gathering supplies and packing them into a leather satchel that had seen better days but was still sturdy enough to carry what little Serafina would be able to take with her into exile. And through it all, Elena was talking in a low, urgent voice about things that didn't make sense, about Serafina's mother and secrets that had been kept, and bloodlines that were more important than anyone realized. But Serafina's mind was still back at the ceremonial grounds, still processing the rejection, still trying to understand how she was supposed to survive what came next, when she could barely survive what was happening right now. The inside of Elena's cabin felt simultaneously like a sanctuary and a prison, as Serafina stood there, trying to make sense of the old healer's words, which were tumbling out in a rushed stream of consciousness that seemed to contain fragments of truth mixed with things that sounded like fever dreams or wishful thinking. And Elena's weathered hands were moving with practiced efficiency as she packed dried meat and travel bread into the worn leather satchel alongside bundles of healing herbs that Serafina recognized from years of watching the woman work. Though why she would need such supplies when she was likely going to freeze to death or be torn apart by rogues within a week of leaving pack territory was a question she didn't have the energy to ask aloud. The cabin's interior was exactly as Serafina remembered from the countless hours she had spent here learning the healing arts, with bundles of dried herbs hanging from the exposed ceiling beams, filling the air with their pungent medicinal scents. Shelves lined with clay jars containing salves and tinctures and poultices for every ailment imaginable, and the large work table in the center of the room, scarred and stained from decades of preparing remedies. But tonight, everything looked different somehow, as if the rejection ceremony had fundamentally altered her perception of reality, and nothing would ever look quite the same again, because she was seeing it all through the lens of someone who had been cast out and condemned to die alone in the wilderness, like some character from a tragic story that children would be told as a warning about what happened to wolves who were born wrong. Your mother told me something before she died, something I swore I would never reveal unless it became absolutely necessary. And child, I think tonight has made it necessary because you need to understand that what happened out there on those ceremonial grounds wasn't about you being defective or cursed or any of the other cruel things Garrett said, Elena was saying as she added a small knife with a worn leather handle to the growing pile of supplies. And Serafina found herself focusing on the blade rather than on Elena's words because the knife was tangible and real and made sense in a way that talk of secrets and hidden truths did not, especially not when her entire world had just collapsed around her ears, and she was supposed to somehow process the fact that she had 6 hours, maybe less now, to say goodbye to the only life she had ever known and walk into a future that promised nothing but suffering and death. Your mother wasn't just some low-ranking wolf who happened to have unusual coloring. She was descended from one of the oldest bloodlines in our species, a line that traces back to the very first wolves who were blessed by the moon goddess herself. And your silver hair isn't a curse or a mistake or a sign of something wrong with you. It's a mark of that heritage, a visible manifestation of power that most wolves lost generations ago when the bloodlines became diluted through centuries of interbreeding with common wolves who didn't carry the ancient gifts. And Elena's voice had taken on an intensity that Serafina had never heard before, a fervor that suggested the old woman believed every word she was saying, even though it sounded completely insane, like the kind of story you would tell a child to make them feel better about being different rather than actual historical fact. Serafina wanted to interrupt, wanted to tell Elena that kind stories weren't going to change the reality of her situation, that it didn't matter if her mother had been descended from the moon goddess herself, because she was still being banished from the only pack she had ever known and still going to die alone in the mountains. But her throat felt too tight to form words. And besides, Elena was still talking, still packing supplies with those efficient movements that spoke of years of practice, preparing wolves for journeys they might not survive. The silver hair marks you as a potential life weaver, which is the rarest and most powerful form of healing magic that exists in our world. And your mother had the gift too, though she kept it hidden because she knew that power like that makes you a target, makes other packs want to capture you and use you for their own purposes, or kill you because they fear what they don't understand. And she made me promise that if anything ever happened to her, I would watch over you and teach you the basics of healing, so that the gift wouldn't be completely lost, even if you never fully awakened to your true potential. Elena continued, and she pulled out a thin, silver chain from beneath her collar, a necklace that Serafina had never seen before, despite spending countless hours in this cabin. And dangling from the chain was a small crystal that seemed to glow with an inner light that had nothing to do with the fire burning in the hearth across the room. The crystal captured Serafina's attention in a way that Elena's words had not, drawing her gaze and holding it with an almost hypnotic intensity, and she found herself taking a step closer without consciously deciding to move, her hand reaching out toward the pendant as if pulled by invisible strings. And when her fingers brushed against the cool surface of the crystal, she felt something surge through her body like lightning, a rush of energy that started at the point of contact and spread outward through her entire being, making every nerve ending light up with sensation and filling her head with images that didn't make sense. Visions of wolves with silver fur running under a full moon, of hands glowing with golden light as they healed wounds that should have been fatal, of a woman who looked like an older version of Serafina standing in a circle of power and channeling energy that made the very air around her shimmer and bend. She jerked her hand back with a gasp that was half shock and half something else, something that felt like recognition, even though she had never experienced anything like that before in her entire life. And Elena was watching her with eyes that held a mixture of satisfaction and sorrow, as if she had expected exactly this reaction, but wished the circumstances that necessitated it were different. That was your mother's crystal, a focus that helped her channel her life weaver abilities, and it recognized you just now because you carry the same blood, the same potential for power that she possessed. And I'm giving it to you now, because where you're going to need every advantage you can get, every tool that might help you survive what's coming. Elena said, and she lifted the chain over her head and held it out to Serafina with both hands, as if she was presenting something sacred rather than just a piece of jewelry, though the way the crystal continued to pulse with that inner light suggested it was far more than mere ornamentation. Serafina took the necklace with trembling fingers and felt the weight of it settle against her palm, warm despite having been tucked against Elena's skin beneath layers of clothing, and she wanted to refuse it, wanted to tell Elena that she couldn't accept something that had belonged to her mother, because accepting it would make all of this real in a way that she wasn't ready to face. But the old healer was already turning back to her packing, already moving on to the next item that needed to be gathered before Serafina's deadline for departure arrived and she was forced to leave whether she was ready or not. Head north into the Frostwood Mountains when you leave here. Don't go east toward the lowlands where other packs have territories and will kill you on sight for trespassing. And don't go west toward the human settlements because they have their own hunters and their own dangers that you're not equipped to handle. And definitely don't go south back toward Shadowmere territory because Alpha Donovan meant what he said about executing you if you return," Elena instructed, her voice taking on the brisk, practical tone she used when teaching Serafina about which herbs to use for which ailments, as if navigating a deadly wilderness alone was just another lesson to be memorized and applied. "The mountains are harsh and unforgiving, especially this time of year, with winter coming on fast and the temperatures dropping below freezing at night. But there are caves in the higher elevations where you can take shelter, places where ancient wolves used to live before the packs formed and claimed territories. And if you're lucky and the moon goddess is watching over you, you might find one that will keep you alive long enough to figure out what comes next." And the way Elena said, "if you're lucky," suggested that she didn't actually think luck was going to have much to do with Serafina's survival, or lack thereof, that she was giving these instructions more out of a sense of obligation to provide some kind of guidance, rather than because she genuinely believed following them would lead to anything other than a slightly delayed death. Serafina finally found her voice, though it came out rough and strained, like she had been screaming for hours, even though she had been silent throughout the entire rejection ceremony. "Why are you telling me all of this now, after 24 years of keeping silent about my mother and her supposed bloodline and these powers I'm meant to have, but have never shown any sign of possessing?" she asked, and there was more bitterness in her tone than she had intended, but she couldn't help feeling angry at Elena for waiting until she was being exiled to reveal information that might have made a difference if she had known it earlier, might have given her some sense of worth or purpose beyond just being the strange-looking orphan that everyone tolerated out of obligation. "If my mother was so powerful, if I'm supposed to have this incredible healing gift, then why have I spent my entire life being treated like I'm worthless and broken and cursed? Why didn't this bloodline you're talking about protect me from Garrett's rejection or Alpha Donovan's banishment? Why does none of this actually matter when I'm still going to end up dead in the mountains before the week is out?" Elena stopped her packing and turned to face Serafina fully, and the sorrow in her ancient eyes was so profound that it made Serafina's anger falter and fade, replaced by a bone-deep weariness that made her want to collapse right there on the cabin floor and sleep for 1,000 years. "I'm telling you now, because your mother made me promise to keep it secret, until you either awakened to your power naturally or until your life was in danger and you needed to know the truth in order to survive. And child, your life has never been in more danger than it is right now. Walking into those mountains alone with winter coming and nothing but the supplies I can give you and whatever strength you can find within yourself," the old healer said, and she crossed the small space between them to take Serafina's face in her weathered hands, forcing eye contact in a way that made it impossible to look away or dismiss what she was saying as the ramblings of someone who had spent too much time alone with her herbs and medicines. "The reason your bloodline didn't protect you from rejection is because power like yours doesn't manifest to prevent pain. It manifests through pain, through suffering and loss and being broken down until there's nothing left but your essential self. And only then, when you've lost everything else, can you access the depths of what you're truly capable of becoming. And I know that sounds cruel and unfair, because it is cruel and it is unfair. But that's how the moon goddess works, shaping her strongest warriors through trials that would destroy lesser souls." The words settled over Serafina like a heavy blanket, smothering and inescapable, and she pulled away from Elena's touch because the kindness in it was somehow harder to bear than Garrett's cruelty had been. Because cruelty she understood and expected, but compassion in the face of her complete and utter destruction felt like a weapon designed specifically to break whatever fragile control she was maintaining over her emotions. "I don't want to be a warrior or have special powers or be part of some ancient bloodline. I just wanted to belong somewhere, To have a pack and a mate and a normal life where people didn't look at me like I was something wrong and broken? Serafina said, and her voice cracked on the last word. The sob she had been holding back since the rejection ceremony finally breaking free and tearing through her chest like a physical wound. I don't want to go into the mountains and freeze to death, or get torn apart by rogues. I don't want to be alone anymore. I've been alone my entire life, even when I was surrounded by the pack, because being lonely in a crowd is worse than being physically isolated. And I'm so tired of being strong and surviving and trying to prove I'm worth something, when clearly the universe has decided I'm not worth the effort. Elena let her cry, didn't try to offer empty comfort or tell her everything would be fine when they both knew it wouldn't be. And when the sobs finally subsided into hiccuping gasps and Serafina's eyes felt swollen and raw, the old healer pressed the leather satchel into her hands, along with a thick fur-lined cloak that was significantly warmer than the thin one Serafina had been planning to wear. This cloak belonged to your mother. I've kept it all these years, waiting for the right time to give it to you. And I know it's not enough. I know nothing I can give you is enough to make up for what's been taken from you tonight. But please, child, please take these things and head north like I told you, and try to survive. Because I have a feeling, just a whisper from the moon goddess, or maybe just an old woman's hope, that this isn't the end of your story, but rather the beginning of something you can't even imagine yet. And there was such conviction in her voice that Serafina almost believed her, almost let herself hope that maybe there was some purpose to this suffering beyond just cosmic cruelty. The next few hours passed in a blur of preparation and painful goodbyes, with Elena teaching Serafina how to identify safe caves versus dangerous ones, how to purify water from mountain streams, how to set snares for small game if she got desperate enough to need food beyond the supplies in the satchel. And all the while the clock was ticking down toward dawn, and the moment when she would have to leave the cabin and walk away from the only person who had ever cared whether she lived or died. When the first hints of gray began to lighten the eastern sky, and they both knew she couldn't delay any longer, Elena walked her to the edge of packed territory, where the forest grew thick and dark, and the paths became uncertain. And there, in the pre-dawn gloom, the old healer embraced her one final time, whispering words that sounded like prayers or blessings, or possibly both, into Serafina's silver hair. The moon goddess has plans for you, child, plans that a pack like Shadowmere could never understand or appreciate, and I believe, with every fiber of my being, that you're going to survive this, that you're going to find your way to exactly where you need to be, even if the journey to get there breaks your heart and tests your spirit in ways you never imagined possible, Elena said. And then she was stepping back, was watching with eyes full of tears, as Serafina adjusted the heavy satchel on her shoulder and pulled the fur-lined cloak more tightly around her body. And there was nothing left to do but turn and walk into the forest, into the unknown, into a future that promised nothing but hardship and loneliness, and the very real possibility of death. Serafina walked for 8 hours straight, heading north as Elena had instructed, following game trails and old paths that seemed to lead deeper into the wilderness with every step, and the forest around her grew gradually more wild and untamed, the trees taller and more ancient, the undergrowth thicker and more difficult to navigate, until she felt like she had left the civilized world behind entirely and entered some primordial landscape that existed outside normal time and space. The temperature dropped as she climbed higher into the foothills of the Frostwood Mountains, and she was grateful for her mother's cloak, which kept the worst of the cold at bay even as her breath began to fog in the increasingly frigid air. And she tried not to think about what would happen when night fell and the temperature dropped even further. Tried not to imagine herself freezing to death alone in the dark, with no one to mourn her passing, or even know that she had died. Her legs ached from the constant uphill climbing, and her stomach growled with hunger, even though she had eaten some of the travel bread from her satchel a few hours earlier, and she was just thinking about finding a place to rest for a few minutes when she felt it. A sudden change in the air that made every hair on her body stand on end and sent her wolf instincts screaming warnings that something was very, very wrong. The blizzard hit without any warning whatsoever, transforming the cold but clear morning into a whiteout nightmare in the space between one heartbeat and the next. And Serafina had just enough time to register that this wasn't natural, that no storm could possibly form this fast without magical interference. Before the wind became so strong, it nearly knocked her off her feet, and the snow became so thick she couldn't see more than a few inches in front of her face. She stumbled forward blindly, one arm raised to protect her eyes from the stinging ice crystals that pelted her exposed skin like tiny knives. And she knew with a certainty that came from some deep instinctual place that if she didn't find shelter soon, she was going to die. Not eventually, or possibly, but soon, within the hour, if the storm continued at this intensity. Her fingers had already gone numb despite the cloak's warmth, and her feet were losing sensation with every step she took through snow that was accumulating at an impossible rate, already mid-calf deep and getting deeper by the minute. And she could feel her body temperature dropping, could feel the first insidious whispers of hypothermia beginning to cloud her thoughts and make her limbs feel heavy and uncoordinated. She didn't know how long she wandered through the blinding snow, time losing all meaning when every direction looked exactly the same, and every step was a monumental effort that required conscious decision and will to execute. But at some point, she became aware of a sound cutting through the howling wind, a whimpering that was desperate and pained and somehow more animal than human, though she couldn't have explained why she knew that. Every survival instinct she possessed screamed at her to ignore it, to focus on her own survival and not waste precious energy investigating sounds that might lead her further from potential shelter. But her healer's heart, the part of her that Elena had carefully nurtured over years of training, overrode those practical concerns and pulled her toward the source of the whimpering, like a fish being reeled in on a line. She stumbled through a drift that came up to her thighs and nearly fell, caught herself against what she thought was a tree, but turned out to be a rocky outcropping, and as her frozen fingers touched the stone, she felt something, a pull deeper than instinct, a recognition that whispered this way, "This is where you need to be." And she followed that pull around the edge of the outcropping to find a cave entrance that had been completely invisible from any other angle, hidden by the rock formation and the blowing snow, in a way that seemed almost deliberately concealed. The whimpering was coming from inside the cave. Multiple voices now that she was close enough to distinguish individual sounds, and Serafina hesitated at the entrance because walking into an unknown cave where injured and frightened animals were trapped was potentially the stupidest thing she could do. But then again, she was already dying from exposure and had nothing left to lose. So she ducked her head and stepped into the darkness. And her eyes took a moment to adjust from the blinding white of the blizzard to the dim interior of the cave. And when they finally did adjust, she stopped breathing altogether, because what she saw was impossible, was something that couldn't be real, was 12 massive wolves arranged in a protective circle, all of them with silver-white fur that seemed to glow even in the darkness, all of them clearly injured and suffering and on the verge of death. And right in the center of them all was the largest wolf Serafina had ever seen in her entire life. A magnificent beast that had to be at least 4 feet tall at the shoulder, with a thick ruff of fur around its neck and ice blue eyes that locked onto hers the moment she entered the cave, and even in her hypothermic state, even with her mind struggling to process what she was seeing, Serafina felt something snap into place deep in her chest, a connection that seemed to vibrate through every cell of her body and settle into her bones like it had always been meant to be there. And the wolf's eyes widened in what looked like recognition and desperate hope. And somewhere in the back of her failing consciousness, Serafina understood that she had found something in this cave, or perhaps something had found her, and that nothing about her life was ever going to be the same again. The cave floor was slick with blood and melted snow, and Serafina's frozen limbs protested every movement as she dropped to her knees beside the largest wolf, whose ice-blue eyes were tracking her with an intensity that spoke of intelligence far beyond what any normal animal should possess. And she knew without being told that these were shifters who had been caught in the same magical blizzard that had nearly killed her. Warriors who had managed to drag themselves to this shelter, but who lacked the strength to shift back to human form or to heal their own injuries. And looking at the deep gashes across the big wolf's shoulder and the arrow embedded in his side, seeing the way his breathing was labored and his silver fur was matted with blood that had frozen into icy clumps, she understood that he was dying and that all 12 of these magnificent creatures would be dead within hours if someone didn't help them. Her healer's instincts kicked in despite her own hypothermic state, despite the fact that her fingers were so numb she could barely feel them and her body was shaking so violently from the cold that she had to clench her jaw to keep her teeth from chattering loud enough to echo through the cave. And she shrugged off the heavy satchel that Elena had packed with supplies, her movements clumsy and uncoordinated, but driven by a determination that came from somewhere deeper than conscious thought. From that same place that had made her drag herself through the blizzard to investigate the sounds of suffering, rather than focusing solely on her own survival. "I'm going to help you, all of you, but you need to stay calm and let me work, because some of this is going to hurt, and I can't have you panicking or trying to bite me when I'm just trying to save your lives," Serafina said, her voice coming out rough and strained from the cold and from hours of not speaking to anyone. And she was talking partly to reassure the wolves and partly to reassure herself, to maintain some connection to rationality and purpose, when everything else about this situation was completely insane. She started with the largest wolf because he was clearly the most severely injured, and because those ice-blue eyes were watching her with such desperate hope that she couldn't bear to look away, couldn't stand the thought of watching that hope die if she chose to help the others first. And she pulled out Elena's knife and began cutting away the frozen fur around the arrow wound, exposing the inflamed and infected flesh beneath, while the wolf trembled under her touch, but didn't pull away or show any signs of aggression despite what had to be excruciating pain. The arrow had to come out. She knew that much from her training with Elena, but removing it would cause massive bleeding, and she would need to be ready with pressure and healing herbs to stanch the flow before he bled out right here on the cave floor. And her hands were shaking so badly from the cold that she wasn't sure she could manage the delicate work required. But she had to try because the alternative was watching him die, and she had seen enough death in her life already, had lost enough people she cared about. And even though she didn't know this wolf or understand why his pain affected her so deeply, she knew she couldn't add his death to the list of losses she carried in her heart. "This is going to hurt. I'm so sorry. But the arrow is poisoned, and it has to come out now, or the poison will spread to your heart, and there won't be anything I can do to save you," she whispered, positioning her hands on the arrow shaft and trying to calculate the best angle for removal that would cause the least additional damage to the surrounding tissue. And she saw understanding flash in those blue eyes, saw acceptance and trust that she absolutely did not deserve, given that she was a complete stranger who had stumbled into their shelter. But there was no time to question it, no time to wonder why this wolf was looking at her like she was something precious and important, rather than the cursed reject that Garrett and the entire Shadowmere pack had deemed worthless. She pulled the arrow out in one smooth motion that was more luck than skill, and the wolf made a sound that was somewhere between a whimper and a howl, and blood immediately began pouring from the wound in a steady stream that made Seraphina's heart clench with fear. Because there was so much of it. Too much. And she grabbed the healing herbs from her satchel with fingers that were barely functional and pressed them directly into the wound, applying pressure with both hands while she muttered prayers to the moon goddess that she wasn't sure she even believed in anymore after everything that had happened. The crystal that Elena had given her. Her mother's crystal that hung around her neck beneath her clothing, suddenly grew warm against her skin, the heat building until it was almost uncomfortable, and Seraphina felt something surge through her body that was similar to what she had experienced in Elena's cabin, but 1,000 times more powerful. A rush of energy that started in her chest where the crystal rested and flowed down through her arms and into her hands where they pressed against the wolf's wound, and she watched in stunned disbelief as her palms began to glow with a soft, golden light that seemed to sink into the wolf's flesh, knitting torn tissue back together and pushing out the poison in black rivulets that oozed from the wound before the skin sealed completely, leaving only a pink scar where moments before there had been a gaping hole that should have been fatal. The wolf's eyes widened in shock that mirrored her own, and Seraphina pulled her hands back and stared at them like they belonged to someone else, like they were foreign objects attached to her wrists that had just performed a miracle she didn't understand and hadn't known she was capable of. And the golden glow was already fading, but she could still feel the energy thrumming through her veins, could feel power that she had never accessed before, suddenly available and waiting to be directed wherever she chose to send it. What was that? What did I just do? I've never been able to heal like that before. I've used herbs and bandages and set bones, but I've never made wounds close with light and energy, she said to the wolf, knowing he couldn't answer her in his current form, but needing to voice her confusion aloud because keeping it inside felt like it would make her explode. And the wolf made a soft, chuffing sound that might have been reassurance or might have been his own confusion. And then he was struggling to his feet with obvious effort, still weak from blood loss and whatever other injuries he had sustained, but alive and healing and no longer on the immediate verge of death. Seraphina moved on to the other wolves, working her way around the circle and using this newfound power that apparently had been sleeping inside her all along, waiting for the right combination of desperation and need to awaken it. And she healed gashes and broken bones and hypothermia and internal bleeding, and with each wolf she treated the process became slightly easier, the energy flowing more smoothly, as if she was learning to use muscles she hadn't known existed. And by the time she reached the 12th wolf, her hands were moving with confidence, and the golden light was responding to her will rather than just pouring out uncontrolled. The storm outside was still raging when she finally finished treating the last wolf's injuries, and Seraphina collapsed against the cave wall with exhaustion that went deeper than physical tiredness, a bone-deep weariness that came from channeling more power than her untrained body knew how to handle. And she was dimly aware that she was still dangerously cold, that her own hypothermia hadn't magically resolved itself just because she had healed 12 wolves, and she knew she should probably try to start a fire or do something to warm herself before she passed out. But her limbs felt like they were made of lead, and her eyelids were so heavy that keeping them open required more effort than she could currently manage. She felt, rather than saw, the largest wolf move closer to her, felt the warmth of his massive body as he settled beside her and carefully arranged himself so that his bulk was blocking the cave entrance and the worst of the wind, while his thick fur provided insulation against the cold stone. And the other 11 wolves were moving too, positioning themselves around her in a protective circle that trapped heat and created a living barrier between her fragile human body and the deadly cold that wanted to claim her life. And Seraphina felt tears sliding down her frozen cheeks, because these strangers, these wolves she had just met and healed, were protecting her in a way that her own pack never had, were offering her warmth and safety without demanding anything in return. And the contrast between their instinctive care and Garrett's calculated cruelty was so stark that it made something crack open in her chest, some wall she had built to protect herself from feeling too much. She must have passed out at some point, because when she opened her eyes again, the cave was brighter, filled with the gray light of day filtering through the cave entrance where the blizzard had finally stopped, and she was warm for the first time since leaving Elena's cabin, surrounded by wolves who had apparently maintained their protective formation throughout the night to ensure her survival. And when she tried to sit up, her body protested with aches and pains that suggested she had pushed herself far beyond safe limits with the healing she had performed. The largest wolf was awake and watching her with those penetrating ice-blue eyes. And as she met his gaze, she felt that strange connection in her chest pull tight, felt recognition of something she couldn't name, but that seemed fundamentally important in ways she didn't have the experience or knowledge to understand. And she reached out without thinking to touch his silver fur, running her fingers through the soft pelt and marveling at how something so beautiful could exist in a world that had spent her entire life telling her that beauty was something she would never possess or deserve. "Thank you for keeping me warm, for protecting me when you had no reason to care whether I lived or died," Seraphina whispered, and the wolf leaned into her touch with a gentleness that seemed almost reverent. And then something extraordinary happened, something that made Seraphina's breath catch in her throat and her heart start racing with a mixture of fear and anticipation, because the wolf was shifting, his form blurring and reshaping, until where moments before there had been a massive silver wolf, there was now a man, tall and muscular and devastatingly handsome, with silver hair that fell to his shoulders and ice-blue eyes that were even more striking in his human face than they had been in his wolf form. And he was reaching for a cloak that had been tucked in a pack near the cave wall, wrapping it around himself to preserve modesty before he turned back to face her with an expression that held so many emotions she couldn't begin to catalog them all. "My name is Lysander Nightshade, and I am the Alpha King of the Lunar Crown Kingdom, and these are my elite guard who serve as my personal protection and advisors, and you, extraordinary woman who saved all of our lives when you had every reason to save only yourself, are my fated mate," he said, and his voice was deep and rich and sent shivers down Seraphina's spine that had nothing to do with residual cold. And she stared at him in complete incomprehension because his words made no sense, couldn't possibly be true, because she was Seraphina Frost, rejected Omega, banished from her pack, cursed with strange appearance and no value, and there was absolutely no way that an Alpha King, a ruler of an entire kingdom, could be claiming her as his mate. "That's not possible. You must be confused or mistaken, or still suffering from the poison, because I'm nobody. I'm nothing. I was literally rejected and cast out less than 24 hours ago by a man who thought I was too defective to even consider as a mate. And you're a king, and kings don't mate with broken Omegas who have been deemed worthless by their own packs," Seraphina said, the words tumbling out in a rush of denial and disbelief, and she tried to stand up, tried to put distance between herself and this impossible man with his impossible claims, but her legs were still weak from exhaustion and hypothermia, and she would have fallen if Lysander hadn't moved with supernatural speed to catch her. His hands gentle but firm on her arms as he steadied her. The man who rejected you was a fool who couldn't recognize a treasure, even when it was offered to him freely. And you are not broken or worthless, or any of the other lies that your pack told you to justify their own blindness and cruelty, Lysander said, and there was such conviction in his voice, such absolute certainty, that Seraphina felt her carefully constructed defenses beginning to crack. Felt the possibility that maybe, just maybe, she wasn't the worthless creature she had always been told she was starting to take root in her heart. Your silver hair marks you as descended from the ancient bloodlines, the original wolves who were blessed by the moon goddess herself, and your healing power, the way you channeled life energy to save us when any normal healer would have been limited to herbs and bandages, that marks you as a life weaver, which is the rarest and most powerful form of healing magic that exists in our world. And there hasn't been a life weaver born in over 3 generations, and you have no idea how special you are, how precious, how absolutely perfect you are exactly as you are. And he was looking at her like she hung the moon and stars, like she was something miraculous rather than mundane, and Seraphina wanted to believe him so badly it physically hurt. Wanted to accept that maybe her entire pack had been wrong about her, and that the rejection that had felt like the end of her world was actually the beginning of something she couldn't even imagine. The other wolves had shifted to human form now. 11 warriors of varying ages, all dressed in the cloaks and supplies they had managed to carry with them before the magical blizzard had trapped them. And they were watching the exchange between their king and Seraphina, with expressions that ranged from protective approval to curious interest. And one of them, a grizzled warrior with scars across his face and silver-white hair that suggested he was from the same royal bloodline as Lysander, stepped forward and bowed to Seraphina with a respect that made her deeply uncomfortable, because she had never been treated with respect in her entire life and didn't know how to respond to it. My name is Marcus, and I am the head of the elite guard, and on behalf of all of us, I want to thank you for saving our lives when you could have walked past this cave and saved yourself. And I want you to know that we recognize you as our king's true mate and our future Luna Queen, and we pledge our loyalty and protection to you from this moment forward, he said. And the other 10 warriors echoed his words in a chorus of agreement that made tears spring to Seraphina's eyes, because this couldn't be real, couldn't possibly be happening, because things like this didn't happen to rejected Omegas who were supposed to die alone in the mountains. The next several days passed in a blur of recovery and revelation, with Lysander explaining that he and his guards had been on a border patrol when they were ambushed by a rival pack attempting to assassinate him, that the magical blizzard had been a trap designed to kill them slowly through exposure when the initial attack had failed, and that they had barely managed to reach the cave before succumbing to their injuries and the deadly cold. And if Seraphina hadn't found them and healed them with her life weaver abilities, they would all have been dead before morning. He told her about his kingdom, about the prophecy his mother had shared before she died, that spoke of a mate with moonlight hair and healing touch who would appear when he needed her most. And he told her about the 3 years he had spent searching for his fated mate without success, meeting countless Omegas who were beautiful and accomplished and eager to be queen, but none of whom had made the mate bond sing in his chest the way it had the moment Seraphina had walked into that cave. I felt it the instant I saw you, felt the bond snap into place like coming home after a long journey. And I knew immediately that you were mine and I was yours, and that everything I had been through, every rejection I had given to Omegas who weren't right, every lonely night wondering if the moon goddess had forgotten about me, All of it had been leading me to you, Lysander said, as they sat together by the fire that the guards had built once the storm cleared. And Seraphina was wrapped in furs, and finally warm all the way through, and she was trying to process the fact that this incredible man, this king, wanted her not despite her silver hair and strange appearance, but because of it, because those very things that had made her pack reject her were the markers that had helped him recognize his fated mate. The journey to the Lunar Crown Kingdom took 5 days, with Lysander insisting that Seraphina ride on his back in his wolf form because she was still recovering from the hypothermia and the massive expenditure of energy that healing 12 wolves had required. And she spent those days wrapped in furs and clinging to his silver pelt while the elite guard ranged around them in protective formation. And at night, Lysander would shift back to human form, and they would talk for hours about everything and nothing, about her painful childhood and his lonely reign, about her dreams of belonging somewhere and his hopes for finding a partner who could rule beside him, not just as decoration, but as an equal who brought her own strengths and perspectives to the role of Luna Queen. He courted her with a patience and respect that she had never experienced before, never pushing for physical intimacy beyond holding her hand or brushing her hair back from her face, always asking permission before touching her and respecting her boundaries in ways that made her feel valued and cherished rather than used and discarded. And with each day that passed, Seraphina felt herself falling more deeply in love with this man who saw her true worth when her own pack had been blind to it. The palace of the Lunar Crown Kingdom was more beautiful than anything Seraphina had ever imagined. A massive structure of white stone and ice-blue crystals that seemed to glow from within. And when Lysander introduced her to his court as his fated mate and future Luna Queen, she saw shock and surprise on many faces, but also acceptance and even excitement, because a Lifeweaver hadn't been seen in generations, and her abilities would be invaluable to the kingdom. And for the first time in her life, Seraphina understood what it felt like to be wanted, not just tolerated, to be valued, not just endured, to be celebrated rather than hidden away like something shameful. The mating ceremony was held under the full moon 3 weeks after they arrived at the palace. 3 weeks during which Lysander had courted her properly and given her time to adjust to her new life and to understand that his desire for her was real and permanent rather than some temporary infatuation that would fade once the novelty wore off. And when he marked her neck in front of the assembled kingdom, and she marked him in return, the mate bond that had been pulling at them since that first moment in the cave finally completed with a surge of power that made the very air shimmer with silver and violet light. And Seraphina felt whole for the first time in her entire life, felt like all the broken pieces of herself had finally found their proper places and locked together into something beautiful and strong and unbreakable. Years later, when young wolves would come to her feeling broken and rejected and worthless, Seraphina would take their hands in hers and tell them her story, would share how she had been cast out by her pack and told she was cursed and defective, how she had walked into a blizzard expecting to die and instead had found 12 dying wolves in a cave and had discovered powers she never knew she possessed, and how the man who would become her mate and make her a queen had been waiting for her in that cave, had recognized her worth when her own pack had been too blind to see it. The rejection that feels like the end of your world might actually be the moon goddess redirecting you toward your true destiny, toward the place and the people who will recognize your value and cherish you exactly as you are. She would tell them, and she would watch hope bloom in their eyes the same way it had bloomed in hers when Lysander had first told her she was precious and perfect and everything he had been waiting for. She would introduce them to Lysander, still as devoted to her as he had been that first day, and to their children who had inherited both their parents' silver hair and Seraphina's life weaver abilities, and she would show them that happy endings were possible, even for wolves who had been rejected and cast out. That the moon goddess truly did have a plan, even when that plan involved pain and loss and trials that seemed designed to break you. Because sometimes you had to be broken down completely before you could be rebuilt into something stronger and more beautiful than you ever could have been if you had stayed in the place that didn't value you. And in the quiet moments when Seraphina was alone, when she had time to reflect on the journey that had brought her from that terrible rejection ceremony to her current life as Luna Queen of the Lunar Crown, she would touch the crystal that still hung around her neck, her mother's crystal that had awakened her power at exactly the moment she needed it most, and she would whisper thanks to Elena for giving her the supplies and knowledge that had kept her alive long enough to reach that cave, and to her mother, who had passed down the bloodline that had marked her as special, even when everyone else thought she was cursed, and to the moon goddess, who had taken the worst night of her life and transformed it into the beginning of everything she had ever wanted, but had been too afraid to hope for. Because hope, she had learned, was not weakness, but rather the greatest strength of all. The thing that kept you walking through blizzards and healing strangers, and believing that somewhere out there, your true home and your true family and your true mate were waiting for you to be brave enough to find them. So if you enjoyed Seraphina and Lysander's story, this tale of a rejected Omega who became a beloved queen, of a woman who was told she was worthless but who discovered she was actually priceless, of an alpha king who waited years for his fated mate and recognized her immediately even when she was covered in blood and half frozen and didn't believe she deserved to be loved, then please subscribe to this channel because there are so many more stories to tell about werewolves and fated mates and the magic that happens when two souls recognize each other across whatever distance or darkness separates them. Leave a comment below and tell me what you thought of Seraphina's journey from rejection to acceptance. Tell me if you've ever felt like she did, like you were too different or too broken to deserve good things, and tell me what kind of werewolf romance you'd like to see next, because your engagement and support mean everything and help me create more content that celebrates the truth that our differences aren't flaws to be hidden, but rather gifts to be unwrapped. That rejection from the wrong people is often protection from the moon goddess, and that the mate bond finds us not when we're perfect, but when we're finally ready to accept that we're worthy of love exactly as we are. Thank you for reading, and I'll see you in the next story where we'll explore more tales of alphas and omegas, of fated destinies and second chances, and of the transformative power of finding someone who sees your true worth when the rest of the world has been blind to it.